Hey guys, so YCS Las Vegas just concluded this past weekend, and so as usual, I wanted to provide an overview of the most played hand traps and staples among the topping lists that were available. And so before I continue, big thanks to my sponsors, as always, links and discount codes below for Yu-Gi-Oh supplies. So first, in terms of top cut breakdown, so this was the top 8 breakdown, and by the way, definitely go check out the Card Launcher store on Facebook and Instagram. Definitely a really good resource for deck lists. And so I think Konami made the top 8 deck information publicly available, and that's why these visuals were made already. But in terms of the actual top cut, which was top 16, that I don't think was widely available, and I know some people were hunting them down. And so definitely go check out Seto 360 as well as Team Set Pass on YouTube. I'll put the links down below. They actually have the breakdowns for top 16, and I'll just rely on you guys to check them out for that breakdown. And so in terms of the actual available list, that I could use for the analysis, because not everyone has their deck list posted on a channel for a profile or on Twitter or something like that. So I managed to hunt down 37 deck lists out of the 48, because there's of course 16 top 16 teams and 3 players each. And so by and large, in terms of the representation among the lists that I collected, still I think reflect for the most part the actual topping 48 lists. So that's good to know. Of course, sometimes if certain decks were more likely to be available in terms of deck lists, that could kind of skew the results for these analyses, especially if certain decks were more likely to play a specific hand trap or staple. Prime example is something like Shifter, which only certain decks can play. So anyways, this is the breakdown, and so this is what the analysis of the hand traps and staples will be based on. So in terms of hand traps overview, so in the main deck, it ranged from 0 to 15 hand traps, and the median was 6 hand traps. So now I've been doing these analyses for about at least 2 years, and so usually it's around 6 to 8 in terms of main. The last time I did this analysis was for YCS Sydney, because I skipped the one in France because that was just before the new ban list was about to come into effect. And so in the YCS Sydney one, the median was actually 12. It was very, very high. Now, technically, part of that has to do with, Kelbeck, for example, being treated as a hand trap, because it technically is, but that does boost the numbers, even though it's primarily used as a miller. But now we're sort of away from that when we're back to, quote unquote, what I would call kind of standard hand traps. And so 6 hand traps in the main, and then median of 3 hand traps in the side deck, which is very, very standard. Historically, since I've been doing this, it's always been around 3. And if you see my hand trap trend analysis video where I go through sort of the most played hand traps over the past year, you'll see that this is quite consistent. In terms of board breakers, and I'm only really looking at going second board breaker. So for example, technically, you could argue something like Torrential Tribute. That could be a board breaker, but it's not something you ideally, want to do it going second. You can, but I'm just sort of treating cards like, evenly matched, like Book of Eclipse, things like that. And so the median in the main deck was 5 board breakers, and this is abnormally high compared to previous historical trends. Usually in the main, it only ends up being essentially like 0 to 1. Now we're in a format, Kashtira, most people are main decking things like Book of Eclipse, and especially something like Labrynth, even they main deck evenly because they have very easy access to it. So this is kind of interesting. It's a bit of a blip in the normal side of things in terms of history, but maybe this becomes a norm as well. In the side, it dropped to a little bit from 5. It usually was around 6 in the last format, but of course that's because they're playing so many in the main deck that you don't have as many in the side. So that's kind of shifted. So this is kind of an interesting trend to see. So in terms of the most common hand traps, I'll cover the top 10 most played as usual, and I'm kind of, in a way, happy to see that Ash Blossom is back at its number 1 spot. For those of you that followed my channel for quite some time, you'll know that Ash Blossom has sort of been the king of hand traps in terms of having that number 1 spot. But ever since we entered this Tier 0 tournament format, Ash just sort of dipped down and play a lot, as well as the more of the, traditional hand traps, and became more bestial focused. But now we're back to Ash. It's very good right now because of presumably, going into this event, people thought Branded would do really well, and they ended up doing it and doing well. And Branded Fusion, of course, Ash is very, very strong against that card and that deck strategy in general. And Ash can actually also stop Book of Eclipse, which a lot of people are main decking, and something like Kashtira players are probably also playing Ash to have a way to stop that. The next one is another one that we haven't seen quite some time in this high spot is Nibiru. And this is kind of an interesting one because I think going into the event, people were probably, at least I was, wondering whether, of course, Kashtira players look like they were gearing towards just playing Ibli for sure to try to stop that Nibiru. But of course, it's something that they play 3 of, so it's not really a guaranteed kind of thing. They do play Prosperity, but still. And Nibiru, as you saw in that stream in the finals with John, fellow Canadian, by the way, that Nibiru was really, really clutch and just totally turned the things around. And so it's a very strong card. I'm not quite sure. Nibiru is always in this weird situation where, if people were to assume that the top decks don't really play into Nibiru or doesn't affect them at all, then they stop using Nibiru. But then as that format evolves, people start playing greedy, and then now Nibiru becomes good again, and it just sort of has this like paradox relationship. The next one is Dimension Shifter. Usually you don't see it this high because this is generally a card that's only be able to optimize in very specific decks. For example, Thunder was the best example previously. Now it's Kashtira, and Kashtira is the most played deck, and that's why Shifter is up here that high. But of course, it's not a card that it's quite frankly, I don't think most decks that are available can actually play this card. But it's certainly, if you can play it, usually one of the strongest ones out there, and just completely shuts down a lot of strategies. Infinite Impermanence, usual, kind of stays high. It's been good last format, particularly to stop something like Kit or even Gigantic Spright. So it's a very, very impactful card, and I think it's certainly a strong card, even going second, of course. And so it's a very versatile card, and it also, I guess, technically, against Labrynth, where they're all now playing Skill Drain, it could provide you a way with, usually in normal circumstances, kind of negating a floodgate for a turn. The problem with Labrynth is, not being able to target. That can be very, very challenging. So we technically have Serenir. This now in the current format becomes a card where other decks aren't really playing it other than Branded, and it's technically a hand trap, so I put it here, but realistically it's more of an engine piece for Branded, because I find it kind of funny because decks outside of Branded, back when we were playing Bestials, Serenir was kind of like the worst one, but in Branded it's definitely the best one, because and same with, I guess, maybe Dragon Lake, like if Foolish is that Branded spell trap, like so something like Retribution, and it really gets things going, and it's a very great card. We have Artifact Lancia at 6, so I was very curious how this would go coming into this event. I thought maybe a lot of people might be playing it. Of course, it's very good against Kashtira, but also it's actually very good against Branded as well. In terms of like their fusion plays, it's like surprisingly really, really good. And so I guess it wasn't really seen, at least among the lists that were publicly available. Keep in mind, I am missing 11 lists, but I think it's still something to consider. It's certainly a very strong card. Then we have Magma, and again, this is really just in the Branded list. Not too much to say about that. It's not really seeing that much play outside of those Branded decks anymore, just because tier limits have gone down a lot, essentially, and really became absent. Also have Ghost Spell. This is kind of interesting. It was good last format as well, like stopping those Grave Shufflers, stopping Elf, stopping Tier Element, Kick Hallows, or not Kick Hallows, sorry, just the Tier Element fusions in general. But a lot of those issues are gone. But I think Ghost Spell, for example, in something like Branded, originally when Branded Despia became tier 1, people were playing this a lot, but then they realized maybe it's not so great because, for example, with Branded Lost, you can't even bell. But interesting to still see this, and let me know how you think about this card in this format. Contact C, that was an interesting one, and I think it's really cool how these pro players are so well prepared for events like this, where I didn't even consider Contact C at all. I'm sure a lot of people didn't, but they were already so prepared for it heading into the event. For example, if you saw John's profile for Branded, he was playing that one, I forget the name now, but to be able to just fuse this away as a material because it just requires an effect monster. So Contact C, for those of you not as familiar with this card, basically, when your opponent like specials a monster, like you give it to them and they have to use this as material for like essentially any extra deck mechanic kind of summon, and it's like an insect, so it's usually kind of hard. And the last time I believe this saw some meta play was when Prank Kids was tier 1 for the first time a couple of years ago, and then they would have to play like the Earth Charmer to get around it, but just kind of cool that this is in the mix again. And then lastly, a card you probably don't really want to see as being the most played, and I mean, technically only 3 of 37 lists were playing, so it's not really that common, is Dogwood, and that's for time. Admittedly, when I was playing tier lists in the last format, this was actually like my favorite card to draw post-side, because it just almost essentially meant you won the game, because tier limit turns in the mirror took so long that, you would probably win. And I think it's kind of nice to see that, I don't think it's a standard now having to play time cards in this format. Previously, it was kind of necessary because tournament turns were so long, both on their turn and your turn, and time was really a big issue, but now, not so much. Okay, so now in terms of common side deck staples, and I'm not including cards like Pot of Desires or things like that. Those are like just main deck only. Just cards that are at least sometimes cited. And I'll cover 15 because we do have a lot of deck lists this time. And the first one was actually evenly matched. And that's perhaps not too surprising. It is a very strong card. I think what's interesting though is the number of decks that are main decking it, which is 10 of the 25. And now this is pretty much mostly the Labrynth deck list because they just have an easy way access to it, and it's just very, very powerful going second. And also I think some branded lists were actually main decking a couple cards as well. And I think evenly, it's also particularly strong against Labrynth because if they have that Heavenly Prison and they can protect from like card destruction, evenly is a way to get around that. And especially when, for example, Anti-Spell Fragrance wasn't really played too much this time around, but it was a lot back when Branded Despia was first tier 1, and evenly match can kind of play around that as well, although they might just keep the fragrance. But kind of interesting to see evenly at number 1. I think another comment I would make is that I think there are some concerns with this card. If, for example, Kashtira, if they do have the Ibly lock on you, then now you control a monster and you can no longer evenly. And this also applies for branded. If they were to play Gimmick Puppet and give it to your side of the field, not only does it prevent you from special summoning, you now have a card on the field you cannot use evenly from your hand as the way you want to, or other cards like Lightning Storm, for example. Book of Eclipse, I don't think this is a surprise at all. This was expected to be a very, very strong card going into this format because it does stop things like, or rather, the Kashtira strategy really good against shutting that down and getting your zones back. Not to mention something like, let's say, even Ibly, now you can, because it flips your monsters as well, so it flips it face down and now you're not locked anymore. And that's why the raw lock is also kind of going away. And instead they're just using Gimmick Puppet because it's more of a lingering effect. Book of Eclipse, the downside is that, if all those face down monsters can be flipped face up at the end of the turn, your opponent is going to be able to draw a lot of cards, and definitely don't forget that. But, it's a strong card. I think the interesting thing I noted in that final stream with, Dominic Couch's stream is that they were going for all those back row zones. And I'm not sure if it was particularly because the opponent was playing branded, but I think it's pretty smart because, it prevents you from being able to use Book of Eclipse. So that was kind of an interesting strategy. And then D-Bear, this is not a card I want to see, or I don't think a lot of us want to see this high. This is something we saw again back when Branded Despia and Swordsoul were tier 1 last spring. And what's particularly toxic now is that Labrynth, they just have a very easy way to get into this card. And the fact that when Red Reboot was banned and they limited a pointer, I'm not quite sure why they didn't hit D-Barrier as well, because it's just such an incredibly strong card. And I think in the next ban list, whenever it comes, I think some of the clear choices are, Mind Hacker and D-Barrier, among others, I'm sure. But those are some of the obvious choices. And D-Barrier against Branded, for example, is just so deadly. Like, I don't know what you're supposed to do. So it's a really strong card and not something I think any of us really want to see. Feather Duster is back again. Usually this kind of, it surprisingly isn't like as played much in like all topping lists, for example, even though there's no drawbacks really. A lot of times, people might opt for quick play back row removal depending on the format. Feather Duster, of course, it's nice. Labrynth, they set a lot of back row. The problem is that Heavenly, whatever prison that I had mentioned earlier that protects the back row, but it's still, I think, safe to have. The next card is Talents. This, along with Thrust, are going to be very, very popular. Talents, of course, has been very strong for a while, particularly last format with Tier Limit Mirrors. It was just so crazy in terms of how it would just change the tide of the game. And so, yeah, this along with Thrust, because Thrust can search this, and then now you can do whatever you want with Talents. So I think it's very, very strong. And speaking of Thrust, that was the also played in 14 list. A really strong card. That really depends on your deck as well. I mean, you can search something like evenly, I guess. Going second is probably better because your opponent's more likely to have actual monsters to be able to, for you to be able to activate whatever card you search off of Thrust. Really, really strong card. I think this card might be something that could be banned in the future. I mean, this is another problem with something like D-Barrier existing right now. Like if you go first and you get hand trapped, like you just use Thrust, set D-Barrier, and that might just win you the game anyways. And the crazy thing with Thrust that I only learned recently was that it's just if the monster effect was activated in that turn. Like it's not even just like main phase like Talents. It's just a crazy, crazy strong card. So yeah, it's really good and probably warrants that high price tag. The next one I think is interesting is Dark Hole. And you know, of course, many reasons for that in terms of just instead of Rogeki, because you can also clear away like your Ibli, for example. And I think it's really cool to see such an old and iconic card be actually played in, you know, topping decks in this current format. I actually needed to find a couple dark holes myself, and I realized the only thing I could find in my bulk were like the ones I had as a kid in like 2002, where you know you just store your cards in your pocket and they're like really beat up. I cannot use them, so I had to buy a couple more recently. Lava Golem is another one that I think I actually kind of thought would be higher, but I guess technically, you know, it's something that only certain decks can play, right? Like Kashtira, they don't really rely on normal summons. They're going to be playing this a lot. Same with Branded as well. They're probably signing this though, but again, Branded can get away for the most part without having to normal summon. So Lava Golem is very, very strong. But again, that Ibli lock is just that other issue where if you do have Ibli on your field, you're not going to be able to do Lava Golem because it's actually still a special summon, which some people might get confused because it just says that you cannot normal summon the turn you summon it, but it is still a special summon. So still a very strong board wipe regardless. Can out a lot of cards that you normally would not be able to, but yeah, you do have to consider that Ibli lock. Another one is Enemy Controller, which I think also probably might not be surprising. I think going into this event, we did see a lot of other events where they were playing this. I think it's really strong. For example, just taking away like your opponent's Kashtira rank monster could free up your zone, and also, or just take their Rise Hard because it's beefy and you can like slap on your own Zeus so that you don't have to give whatever monster you took back to them. Really, really strong card. The whole position changing probably isn't not too relevant. Like in the last format, it could come up where, for example, Baguska, you can just change it to like attack mode so that it no longer negates effects, for example, as you're now about to go off. But nowadays, probably it's more so the take effect that's only relevant. And then we have the Ibli that I was mentioning. Some decks were main decking it, and if so, maybe like one copy. And for the purpose of this graph, I still categorize that as, you know, main decking it, even if they play a couple more in the side. So it's obviously a very strong card. I think, like, you know, when Spright was meta, some decks were relying on Ibli instead and giving that off, you know, because you can special off Gigantic. It's a very easy access, although that does mean, you know, you give up on your Toad play. I don't think the Spright list were playing this, actually. It's really just something you see in Kashtira, just to prevent, you know, Nibiru, Evenly, Lava Golem, things like that. It's a very strong card. Jesse Cotton did make a very good video on this card a week or two ago, so definitely go check that out if you haven't. But yeah, not much more to say about that. And then finally, on to the last 5, we do have Solemn Judgment. This is something that we didn't see too much last format, actually. I guess maybe part of that could be because, you know, the half-life point cost, you know, tier element format, it's kind of hard. And actually, to be honest with you, I never felt this card was that good against tier elements anyways, and you're just paying half-life. Your games are going to be very long against tier elements. You're probably losing in time. But now we also have Labrynth as one of the meta decks. They're going to be probably on Solemn Judgment. And even, I'm not sure if the branded list, I can't remember if they were playing this, but, you know, they do lack an Omni Negate unless they're playing Dragoon. So this can be useful for them as well. A Pointer is another card that I think, you know what, I played this myself, but I'd be fine if this card got banned as well eventually. It's really, really strong. You know, if a card like Trap Dust Shoot's banned, I think this will eventually get hit as well. It did get limited recently. You know, just this card's really important because, you know, something like Lava Golem, you know, you can't really stop that. Like, I guess technically one way would be if you were to play, let's say, like, you know, Swordsoul, you like just like shotgun rivalry so that your opponent cannot Lava Golem you. But like realistically, you know, how many decks would do that or have the ability to do that? And so, you know, it's very strong. Just snipes out whatever card your opponent might have, and it's already hard enough right now going second against some of these boards where it sort of becomes now more luck based, where you have to just get that unsearchable out. And if you do, then it's playable, but it's kind of unreliable. Another card is Lightning Storm. I was actually kind of surprised it was this high, only from the sense that, again, because of the Heavenly Prison, just the back row protecting, I thought maybe people would just, you know, gear towards the Evenly Only and maybe Cosmic Cyclones, but I guess people were still on Lightning Storm. I think it's, you know, against Kashtira, they usually place their monsters in defense mode though, so like you don't really hit monsters anymore, but it's still a pretty versatile card, and I guess doesn't hurt to have. And then another interesting choice is the Forbidden Lance. I think this is more of a specific card for, well, not really, but in Kashtira was seen a lot because, you know, makes one of their monsters like unaffected. So, you in terms of, let's say, like Book of Eclipse, they can at least like keep, maybe like a Shangri-La and just keep those zones locked, and then that's probably enough for your opponent to not be able to play. So it's kind of interesting. You kind of saw this sporadically way in the past. I know something like, let's say, protecting like a floodgate monster like Vanity's Ruler or something like that. So kind of interesting to see this come back in play. And then lastly, we have Super Poly. This is really more so just played in Branded right now. It's still a pretty strong card. Of course, you can't respond to it, but it's certainly not seeing as much play as when, let's say, Spright, or rather Tier Elements, Power of the Elements format, because it was so strong back then. It did kind of dip in play, ironically enough, as Tier Elements became Tier 0, but it's still a very strong card nonetheless. Okay, so that was it for the most played hand traps and staples at YCS Las Vegas. Hopefully that was helpful in helping you prepare your side deck list and as you move forward. And so big thanks to my patrons as always: Eileen, Dice Queen, Bolt Spider, Cybernetic, Brandon Jaren, Bear Alert, Spooky Boogie, Steven Phillips, and Chaz Blanks. And well, thanks for watching and take care, guys.